I need to start off with saying what a difference a DA makes, huh? Yeah. We've been learning a lot here. So my name is Whitney Taylor, and I'm the political director at the ACLU of Massachusetts. And I am very excited for where we're going to be going now for the rest of the afternoon, and I hope you all are as well, because learning about what's going on in the world, learning the data, these are all important things to build us up to do what? And this is the next step we have to face, and this is the next step we need to take. I have been asked to do a couple of house cleaning matters, or housekeeping matters. I'm not cleaning tonight. So I just did want to let folks know that what we're going to do is we're going to go through this panel, and then we'll have time for questions for these panelists. Then we're opening up the afternoon session, and my dear colleague Rasan is going to help me facilitate that we actually have what are people doing. A lot of you are already doing work out in the community. You're being advocates. So we actually do want that time period for people to come and share with us what they are doing. That being said, I'm very excited to say these words. I am invoking Professor Ogletree. And we have seen, I just want to make sure as we move forward in this, that we're so excited that everybody's there, as everybody is here and joining us, but we are at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Racial Justice, and we would like to see moving forward. We've had some questions, and not that were not questions. They were actually pontifications, and it ended up being from white men. Not to single out white men, you're awesome too, but let's just keep in mind of what we are and the conversation that we're trying to have. And the first part of this conversation is making sure, as some wonderful colleagues have said, that everybody's at the table so they're not lunch anymore, okay? So, what a difference a DA makes. And here we are in Massachusetts. So what you're going to see from this amazing, amazing panel, and what I'm going to do is let them introduce themselves. But we have this information now. What are we going to do? You're going to be hearing about a lot of different areas that we can start talking to the people who are actually holding district attorneys accountable. Not saying that they're good or bad, but the only people that district attorneys answer to are the voters. I'm the political director. This is awesome. I'm not a lawyer. I have lawyers on speed dial. Thank goodness I get in trouble too much. But I have ACLU lawyers on speed dial. But I'm here for the politics. I'm the political director. And the theme that keeps coming over and over and over again is if we want to see change, we as the voters are the change. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is you're going to hear the context that I am going to be pushing with my agenda, which is what are we going to do here in Massachusetts? What can we do as next steps? And if we can start building these things in Massachusetts, learning from our friends from other cities and other states, what kind of changes can we make together? I also want to put it out there as a challenge. David Harris, the executive director of the Houston Institute, said this morning he would like to see a shift in our terminology. So I would like to put it out there to everybody, instead of saying criminal justice system, let's try it. Can we say legal system? Can we say system of justice? Can we try something else? So it's a little bit of a test to see what we can do, because once again, you're here. We're the beginning. We're the first steps. So the thing that we have seen and the change that can happen with district attorneys and going to the voters, I just want to encapsulate for a little minute. They are the leadership of their offices. They create and keep the culture. They create and set the priorities. So even when line assistant district attorneys are out there doing their work, they're working for their boss. So the boss, the person that is elected, is the one who really is the ultimate responsibility for the culture and the priorities of that district attorney's office. We heard some numbers nationally. I just want to pull it back to Massachusetts for a second. In the last 20 years, there have only 77% of our DA races have gone uncontested. That number would be higher if you pulled out the fact that races where somebody retired or came up, it wasn't really a contested race. They were starting with brand new candidates right from the beginning because somebody retired or somebody moved on. And so it really wasn't a challenge to the sitting DA. It was kind of a new field of people. I also want to talk about in this voting, and thank goodness our friends at the Houston Institute are working on this, looking at voting actually, and then coming out and turning people out to vote, but then actually getting down to vote for DAs. Here in Massachusetts, all of our DAs are going to be up for election in 2018, an off-election year. Little rules of thumb that I think we all know, off-election years have a much lower turnout than presidential years. On top of that, in Massachusetts, when people actually do turn up to vote in an off-election year, over 30% of them don't make it down the ballot to vote for DA. So we're talking about small numbers of people that are giving these individuals and being the oversight to these positions. So I want you all to keep that in mind, because what we're going to be talking about here is what are the issues out there that we can talk to voters about, and that voters should keep in their mind when they are being the ones being the check and balance on our district attorneys. So I want to start first with Scott, and as I said, everybody's going to introduce themselves, and then we'll go down the row, and then we'll do questions specific to this panel. Thank you so much all for being here. 10 minutes.
All right, let's keep the time.
I'm keeping the time.
Thank you. Somebody needs to keep time once I start talking. There I am, Scott Roberts. Hi, folks. My name is Scott Roberts. I am the Senior Criminal Justice Campaigns Director at Color of Change. Color of Change is the nation's largest online organizing group focused on issues affecting Black communities. Our kind of core asset is an email list of local advocates, activists, that has over 1 million folks on it, and so we are constantly trying to find ways to mobilize those members to intervene in issues that are impacting, our communities. We've come to this work around prosecutors really out of an organic process as we're trying to respond to the negative impacts of the criminal justice system. I'm going to call it the criminal justice system, not because it's about criminals, because the system is criminal. So it's a criminal justice system. But there are a lot of issues, right? I think primarily what, when you're talking to 1 million folks online, trying to get them to take actions, and you're really trying to be responsive to where the energy is within the community. It's no surprise to anyone here that whether it's online or in the streets, there were those moments, particularly after the death of Trayvon Martin, but more importantly, after George Zimmerman was acquitted after being prosecuted by Angela Corey's office. There was also a lot of issues with her office in Jacksonville around youth charges, things of that nature. But mostly not being able to get a conviction in situations like that, in situations like the Jordan Davis killing, also in Florida, under similar circumstances. And then, of course, we saw the just increasing energy around police violence and police killings following Ferguson, but then continuing into places like Baltimore, of course, in New York around Eric Garner. This pattern started to emerge. That is really an old pattern, but got a lot more attention because these killings got more attention. And that is that we saw elected district attorneys really basically functioning as defense attorneys for police officers, where they would either just kind of dismiss offhand that there should be charges against officers who'd killed unarmed Black people, or even armed Black people who they didn't have a justification for killing. But also we would see them using tools like the grand jury, for instance, to basically have a kind of a secret place where they could defend the cop. And on the back end, of course, we would see continue just failures to indict and certainly to convict officers. And for us, it was really about police accountability. I'm not, I'm an abolitionist, so I'm not big on, it's not that fun. Sounds good. I'm not that big on locking up cops, frankly. But I think we need accountability, and I think that can come in the form of indictments and convictions. But so for us, that was a big issue, and then of course we started paying a lot closer attention. Seeing the power that prosecutors hold, and the way that they were also fueling mass incarceration through deciding what folks' bail amounts would be, what the charges would be, sentencing recommendations, all the things folks have been talking about today. So we just kind of decided to zero in on these folks, especially around a police accountability framework, mainly because prosecutors, they're elected. Theoretically, we should have leverage with them. But I think what we learned is that, although it's true that, theoretically, that they're only accountable to voters, we found that not to be the case, right? And in fact, our belief is that prosecutors are just too close to police departments frequently to hold them accountable. And they're more accountable to folks like that, or people or others who are contributing to campaigns, in large part because, as folks have been talking about, we have not been engaging in these elections really. So our kind of framework and strategy around criminal justice in general is going after the profiteers in the system, who's benefiting from the status quo, and therefore who has the most investment in maintaining the status quo. So I think when people talk about profiteers in criminal justice, they're often thinking private prison companies, maybe increasingly the commercial bail industry, which we've been collaborating with ACLU on exposing. But we also look at politicians like prosecutors as folks profiting from status quo, the law and order agenda. And so in order to change the incentive, in order to do that, we thought we need to do a couple of things. One is just change the story, right? We needed more people to be informed about the power of the prosecutor. We need to take advantage of the opportunities that were being presented, even with these tragedies, to put the onus on prosecutors. And so we started to really focus in the wake of police killings. I think initially there would be a lot of calls for maybe the police chief to do something, the mayor to do something, the federal government to come in and investigate, something of that nature. And we just started really pointing to prosecutors in almost every instance. Charge the officer or officers that are involved, things of that nature. And, we want to put more attention on them. And I think it started to work. We started to see that in instances like in Cleveland, as someone was mentioning earlier, with Tim McGinty, who failed to get a conviction in the Tamir Rice case, or even get an indictment out of the grand jury, or in the case of Laquan McDonald, where Anita Alvarez had not prosecuted the case, but really covered up the evidence of Laquan's murder. And so, we want to take advantage of those moments to educate people on prosecutors, like what is their power, what is our leverage over them as a community, to increase the number of people who were voting on prosecutor races, but also to start shifting the narrative around what we wanted. What we saw was that, basically since prosecutors have been around, as far as I could tell, prosecutorial elections have been a competition on who can be the toughest, right, on crime. And we really needed to intervene and interrupt that narrative and that incentive structure. And that was, one of the key things that we wanted to do, set up the kind of litmus tests for prosecutors from our perspective. What do we expect from a prosecutor? It's not necessarily law and order, it's police accountability, taking steps to lower incarceration rates, and elevating those issues. So one of the projects I'm really excited about doing that we recently did is, maybe this will be my last notice, in Philadelphia, we worked with a coalition of groups, kind of bringing our experience from working to influence and hold prosecutors accountable in cities around the country, form a local coalition that intervened in the local prosecutor race. I'm sure many folks know here that was won by Krasner, who was kind of a pretty left candidate. But going into the campaign, there was a lot of expectation that the incumbent would run, that he was the favorite. And what we did, we founded a coalition that put together a platform. And so it was kind of a comprehensive platform, our kind of hashtag was decarcerate DA. The idea that the district attorney has a role in lowering incarceration rates as much as Congress or your state legislature or anything like that. And so we put very pointed time-based demands on the candidates while they were running. Will you take steps to decrease the amount of people who are being given money bail? Will you decline to prosecute low-level marijuana offenses? Will you decline to prosecute school-based offenses? There was a range of issues around immigration and the impact that prosecutors have there. And we built a large coalition of community support. I think it became really clear that the center of gravity was shifting. There were articles I think there was an article that said the Philadelphia DA primary has more left turns than the Daytona 500. I don't know if you remember that one. Yeah, that was kind of what we were going for. It wasn't just that particular effort. There are other folks on the electoral side, PACs, that were changing the incentive structure as well with political spending. But we brought in all the candidates, questionnaires, interviews. There was a massive community forum, about 500 people. In Philadelphia, and what we got was really solid commitments from the candidates. And for us, it's about shifting the narrative within the campaigns so that these candidates are then competing against each other to be the most progressive, the least incarcerating candidate. And but also to get the commitments. So when they're there, right? I think this is really key. It's not like, hey, do you want to bring down the folks in pretrial detention, right? And they say yes, and we say, great, we'll vote for you. We say, are you going to do it by the first 100 days? You're going to make these decisions. Will you issue this particular memo to your line prosecutors? And then we have to be there, standing there to hold them accountable, right? And that's what we're hoping to do with a lot of the partners that are already here. I would also say, PICO's local group Power in Philadelphia was also really a key part of that coalition. So with it was really a way of translating the kind of national field of folks working to the local level. But those folks are continuing to work together, and we're really expecting to be in the face of, I think, hopefully Larry Krasner, hoping he wins the general, I guess. But so even though he's the guy who should be on our side, he's got a reputation for defending protesters and stuff like that. We know we got to be in his face to make it happen, and we got to cover him because he's going to get a lot of attacks from the right, from police unions, from the kind of tough on crime, law and order crowd. So I think that's where we're at, trying to shift the narrative and the story around prosecutors, get voters and citizens focused on holding them accountable, and then making them come through on their promises.
Are you done?
No, I'm done.
No? Okay.
She said we can do either one.
This is locked, so that might be an issue. So while we figure this out, I'll just give you all a heads up. So my name's Andrea Marta. I am the National Campaign Manager for the Live Free campaign inside the PICO National Network. PICO National Network is the largest faith-based organization in the country. The Live Free campaign... Yeah, now? Okay. So the Live Free campaign lives inside the PICO National Network. We're the largest faith-based organization in the country. We have federations in 21 states representing about 1 million families in those congregations and communities. And the Live Free campaign is very much focused on stopping the criminalization of folks of color, and very much focused on 2 key metrics. One of them is reducing the number of folks that are locked up in our county jails. We know that's sort of the entryway into the criminal justice or legal, I'm going to try and learn this, legal system. And the second piece is around stopping urban gun violence. It started mostly as urban gun violence in our communities and now has spanned to stopping state-sanctioned violence and how do we hold police officers accountable for their actions. See if we can get this to work. Is it all plugged in?
What does PICO stand for?
PICO used to stand for something else. Now it stands for People Improving Communities Through Organizing.
There it is.
All right, perfect.
There it is.
All right, folks. So this is a Live Free logo. You guys have seen this earlier. The one thing I just want to mention is for us inside PICO, inside the Live Free campaign, we really started to understand the power and discretion of prosecutors around Ferguson. We were invited in to support clergy there. This is a picture actually of a couple of the young folks that we were out in the streets with in Ferguson. They really, really, really helped to shape this thinking, and so I want to make sure that we pause and give them the credit they deserve. Went through this piece. So I just want to talk a little bit about how we think. I have been sharing with our leaders across the country how the power, or what we are calling the axis, and we're actually referring to this as the axis of evil in our communities, operates. So we're seeing, and this goes to a little bit of what Scott was saying around who's profiting, is that there's three main folks. This can look a little different in every community, that are profiting off the incarceration of folks at the county level. Corporations, sheriffs, and DAs. To share a little bit about how we've seen this actually happen or work in our communities, I had the honor and privilege to walk and support Tanti Martinez and Sherry Costa, who are Mario Martinez's mom and aunt. They reached out to us a year and a half ago at this point, actually 2 years ago at this point, because Mario had just died inside Alameda County Jail. This is Oakland, California. This is the progressive Bay Area, quote unquote. I'm from there, so I get to say stuff like this. And so Mario actually had been brought in on a probation violation. He'd been brought in because him and his friends had gone to one of their aunt's houses. His friend forgot the keys, so he ran around the back, let himself in the back door, grabbed what he was there for, and left. While this was happening, the next door neighbor called the cops. They arrested everybody. They held him until trial. The aunt showed up and said, "No, this is my nephew. Him and his friends have access to my house." They dropped the charges on the other three young men, but did not drop the charges on Mario. So Mario got locked up. He had, at that point, 2 children and 1 on the way. He was supposed to be released 3 times. Every time he was supposed to be released, the DA brought new charges against him. So he had charges, brought probation violation, everybody else gets released. He's about to be released, it is in processing, and new charges are brought. Lawyer works with him, is able to get those charges dropped, about to be released, another set is filed, right? So he's living inside prison, basically waiting to go to trial for something that no one can prove at this point. While he was there, he has asthma. While he was there, he started to develop nasal polyps in his nose. And he'd been going to the medical service provider, which is Corizon, a private medical corporation, to try and get that dealt with. He finally had to go and get a judge to order the surgery. Before the surgery could happen, he had an asthma attack. He collapsed in his cell. His cellmate rang the bell. It took him 15 or 20 minutes to get him out of the cell. His cellmate had to pull him out of the cell. No guards came in to help. They never gave him an oxygen mask. They took him out on the yard and they let him die on the yard by himself. So we started to dig into how did all of this happen, right? We knew the DA had these there was this kind of continuous charge piece. But why was Corizon in this facility in the first place? Why were the sheriffs not providing any oversight and making Corizon do these different pieces they were supposed to? And what we found was a trail of money. So Corizon had given the Sheriff Ahern, $110,000 over a few election cycles. In turn, Corizon got a no-bid contract to provide healthcare services for 2 county facilities to the tune of almost $250 million. We know that somehow some of the sheriff's organizations were putting money in one year on a small county race. When you talk about $7,500 into an election, that's a good amount of money. After all of this happened, there were no charges filed against Corizon for Mario's death. No one was held accountable for Mario's death. This is how we really started to see how these folks were working. The people we knew that we had some ability to hold accountable, not necessarily Corizon, although we did get them kicked out of Alameda County. The mom and the aunt fought that battle and they lost their contract, were the DA and the sheriffs. So given all of that work, and then more work that really, I think was led, I know was led by formerly incarcerated folks and folks who have people in the system, we began to really think about what makes what we would call a live-free prosecutor. A lot of this thinking has actually been very much influenced by Scott and Marbury and Katrina and Taylor and a number of other people that are in this room and not. But basically saying that we need a commitment to end mass incarceration, to stop urban gun violence, to hold police officers accountable, to remove racial bias in offices, to protect undocumented immigrants, and in some cases protesters, because we were beginning to see, as people were hitting the streets, harsher and harsher punishments for folks speaking out, especially with this new administration, and then a level of transparency and accountability that we'd never seen. So just to kind of share what this looked like in action in Hillsborough County, and again, Scott and Color of Changes in Hillsborough County and several other folks, we dug in and really built out a campaign that impacted the race. So our game plan in Hillsborough was to focus voter engagement strategy that was really led by formerly incarcerated folks and dreamers, so undocumented or documented folks who had deferred action for childhood arrivals, because those are the folks most directly impacted by the prosecutor's offices. We released what we called a Live Free County study that laid out some of the amazing data that's in Measures for Justice. Measures for Justice wasn't up and running yet, so we had to have someone else dig into the American Survey of Jails to try and get any data to tell us what the prosecutor was up to. We built a really strong black and brown coalition. Doesn't mean we didn't have our white allies around, but we wanted to make sure that this was led by folks that were directly impacted. And then we really had a close collaboration with folks that were on the ground for a long time in Florida. So to do this, not all this might be helpful, but we bought a cell phone list of folks. We knew that's how we were going to get to people. We door knocked in neighborhoods that surrounded our congregations, where we knew that prosecutors and criminal justice or the legal system had truly impacted those communities. And we made sure that the messages that we used were not things that we, like folks far away from the problem, created in some room by themselves. We used messaging that folks in the communities came up with themselves. So here's our Live Free County study for Hillsborough. It's the 31st largest single county jail system in the country. Women in jails, the population had grown 383% between 1985 and 2014. This is the one that really caught folks. 78% of inmates in Hillsborough County had not been convicted, so they were there awaiting trial. And then this other piece, 3.8%, or African American folks were 3.8 times more likely to be in jail than any of their other counterparts. So we took this to our folks, but this was also some of the measures that we started to hold DAs accountable for, because they have a lot of discretion in these different spaces. That 7-8% around bail, they're the ones that let the judges know, or at least give them a sense of what the bail should be for these folks. We talk about a skyrocketing growth of almost 400% for women who are locked up. They have discretion about how different cases are tried. So this is one piece of sort of how we help people understand what that context looked like, and also took it out. Oftentimes, when we talk to folks, we share personal testimonies, and DAs or other folks will come back to us and tell us that's just your experience. That's not really happening. Well, we could show them it really happened. We knocked on doors and shared this out. Our local folks developed this, talked about what the DA was doing, and we did it both in English and Spanish. And purposely went in and talked about the way immigration would impact folks. And then finally, this is what we used at the polling places. So we weren't endorsing anybody, but we were definitely educating voters about what the incumbent had been doing for the last 16 years. And as we did that, one of our Latina immigrant organizers was having a conversation with an African-American mother, and they were talking about all these pieces, and the mom goes, I know exactly who Mark Ober is. And organizer, like a good organizer, goes, well, how? And she goes, because my 14-year-old son was charged and sentenced as an adult 6 months ago. Right, so this is, I think all I want to say is that there's a lot of us in this room that may not be directly impacted by the criminal justice system, but there are plenty of us who are, and those folks are the ones that need to be driving the work. And then just so you can get a picture, this is what our Hillsborough team looked like. They have a meeting, they've had 2 meetings with Andrew Warren. He's going to come out to a big public meeting. And he's basically already begun to commit to bail reform. He wants to look at juvenile justice. And we're trying to get him to look at case acceptance rates, stop and frisk, and then really understand how he impacts immigration issues, because he had no idea that his office could actually be the difference between someone staying in the country or being deported. I'll leave it at that.
I'll just go ahead and speak from here. My name is Dan Alban, and I'm an attorney at the Institute for Justice. We're a nationwide public interest law firm that represents victims of civil forfeiture in cases all over the country. We represent all of our clients pro bono. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, so we can't be involved in elections or any advocacy for candidates or anything like that. But we do also get involved on the legislative side, supporting and helping to draft good bills that reform civil forfeiture practices. Whitney and I have a little bit of a bet here. I'm not sure Whitney knows we have this bet, but how many folks here are familiar with civil forfeiture? Just raise your hand. Great. Now, keep your hand up. No, please keep your hands up for just a second. If you feel like you would feel comfortable coming up here and giving like a 2 or 3 sentence explanation about what it is, just leave your hand in the air. Okay. I understand. It's a confusing issue, and although a lot of people have heard about it, they don't necessarily understand what it is. So I'll just give you a real quick overview, and then I'll explain how civil forfeiture laws are in Massachusetts, tell you about a really bad case that we litigated here, and talk about why this is going on and a reform bill in Massachusetts currently. So civil forfeiture is a legal procedure where the government, the police and district attorney's office, can seize someone's property even if that person has not been convicted of a crime, and even if that person has not been charged with a crime. It's based on a legal fiction that the property itself is somehow to blame for a crime that it has been involved in. And civil forfeiture allows police to seize property not necessarily because the owner of the property committed a crime, but because the property itself was somehow involved in a crime. So a classic civil forfeiture example is a mother lets her son borrow her car. Her son is involved in some sort of, I don't know, dealing pot or something, gets caught by the police in a parking lot. They seize the car that belongs to the mother, not to the son, and they keep the car and eventually try to forfeit the car. And the case looks something like Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus 2004 Toyota Camry or Honda Accord or whatever it is. That's the name of the case. And it's not just cars, it's money. Sometimes it's even houses. The case I'm going to tell you about that happened here in Massachusetts went after a motel. So the way civil forfeiture works is the person who owns the property doesn't have to be convicted of a crime, doesn't even have to be charged with a crime. And in Massachusetts, so this happens all over the country. There are actually 3 states now that have more or less eliminated civil forfeiture, but sadly Massachusetts is not among them. Massachusetts actually has the worst civil forfeiture laws in the entire country. We did, we did a 50-state survey of all of, plus DC, of all forfeiture laws, and Massachusetts and North Dakota together both earned an F. We gave a lot of D's, but only 2 F's, and Massachusetts is one of them. I'll explain why very briefly. Massachusetts has the very lowest burden of proof to forfeit property in the country. All the police have to show is probable cause in order to not just seize the property, you can always seize property with probable cause, to forfeit the property and permanently deprive people of their property interest. Probable cause. The burden is entirely on the owner of the property to demonstrate their own innocence. That's actually fairly common across the country. If you want to make a what's called an innocent owner claim, you bear the burden of proving your own innocence. Think about how difficult that is to do. There is a strong profit incentive in Massachusetts and in many other states because up to 100% of the forfeiture proceeds go right back to the law enforcement agencies that are involved in the seizure and forfeiture. So they go to local police or sheriffs, they go to the district attorney's office. And there is almost no reporting requirements to keep track of all this property that is seized. In Massachusetts, state law enforcement agencies seize an average of about $9.3 million worth of property per year, and forfeit, actually, $9.3 million worth of property per year. Sure. $9.3 million worth of property is forfeited by Massachusetts law enforcement agencies each year, on average. In addition to that, Massachusetts is also one of the worst states in the country for engaging in task forces with the federal government to conduct seizures and forfeitures. It ranks 46th out of 50 states. You don't want to be near the bottom, you want to be near the top, on these equitable sharing forfeitures between the feds and local governments, state and local governments. And nearly $4.5 million per calendar year goes to Massachusetts law enforcement agencies from these federal seizures, where local law enforcement cooperates with the feds to do these large federal seizures. And I'm going to tell you about one of those cases. It happened in Tewksbury, Massachusetts. It involved a small family-owned budget motel called the Motel Caswell. Maybe some of you are familiar with the Motel Caswell. It's not a luxury hotel. It's not the Ritz-Carlton. It's a small family-owned motel, or at least it was until a few years ago. The way this case actually came about is a agent in the DEA office in Boston was going through property rolls and was going through rolls of crimes committed at various properties and came across 2 very important things. A number of crimes committed at one property, and that property was owned free and clear by the property owner and was not part of a corporate chain. That property was the Motel Caswell. There were also similar numbers of crimes committed at a Motel 6 in Tewksbury. There are also crimes committed, shocker, at the Ritz-Carlton and every other luxury hotel anywhere near Tewksbury or anywhere else. But those are part of large corporate chains. If they tried to take their property, they'd have to deal with the corporate lawyers. If they tried to take property that was at least partly under a mortgage, they'd have to deal with the bank's lawyers. But the Motel Caswell was owned free and clear, and it was not part of a corporate chain. So based on a handful of crimes committed over decades, the Fed swooped in with the local law enforcement to seize the Motel Caswell and try to take the entire property because guests at the hotel, not the owners, there was no allegation that the owners of the motel had committed any crimes, because guests at the motel had committed crimes. We represented Russ Caswell and his family, took this case to a week-long trial, and won. And I just want to read a few very short excerpts from the opinion so you understand how bad this case was and why it should have never been brought. Now, this started with a DEA agent in Boston, but it was prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston, Carmen Ortiz's office. And there should have been some adult supervision at some point that said, what are we doing? Why are we trying to take property away from some guy who runs a budget motel and has to deal with crime on his property? But no one ever did that until the federal judge got involved. Here's what the magistrate judge wrote. The government provided no statistical information about the level or type of crimes at the Motel Caswell. Instead, it elected to introduce information about 15 specific drug-related incidents during the period of 1994 to 2008. It should be noted that during this 14-year period, the Motel Caswell rented out approximately 196,000 rooms. So 15 drug-related incidents. But actually, that number was inflated. Of those 15 incidents introduced by the government at trial, 4 cases clearly did not involve drug crimes punishable by more than 1 year of imprisonment, which was the requirement under the statute. And in 4 other cases, it was unclear whether the incident involved a drug crime punishable by more than 1 year of imprisonment. So we're down to 7. You guys want to hear about one of those 7? In one of those 7 cases, Russ Caswell actually let the local police department have a room so they could conduct a sting operation. That was held against him because there was a crime committed on the property because somebody came to make a buy at the sting operation when Russ Caswell let the police have a free room at his hotel. The magistrate judge was not pleased. A few very brief quotes from the magistrate judge's opinion talk about how the the U.S. Attorney's Office engaged in a gross exaggeration of evidence. Again, this is stretching the evidence. Basically, it's a brutal opinion. You can take a look at it. This is a case that never should have been brought. Never should have been brought. So the question is why? Why would you go to all this trouble to go after some poor guy in Tewksbury who owns a budget motel? Well, there's a basic syllogism that is extremely controversial in some places. I have actually been yelled at in legislative hearings simply for stating this. I bet you guys won't find it all that controversial, but it's a 3-part syllogism. The first 2 premises are very easily accepted. Number 1, people respond to incentives. That's just a basic principle. Any economist, regardless of their political leanings, would agree people respond to incentives. Number 2, prosecutors are people. Number 3, prosecutors respond to incentives. The reason that they went after the Motel Caswell is because there is a profit incentive in going after the motel. They would be able to keep all of the property. They would be able to sell the property probably to a developer and keep all of the proceeds. That's true both at the state level. That's also true at the federal level. That profit incentive needs to be eliminated because prosecutors respond to incentives. I've run out of time, so ask me in the questions if you want to know about the legislation, both in Massachusetts and nationwide. And also, I have another really crazy story out of Oklahoma if you want to hear about it.
I would like to hear the story out of Oklahoma. Hi, my name is Josie Duffy Rice. I am the co-director of the Accountable Justice Collaborative and the research director at the Fair Punishment Project, which is actually based here at Harvard Law School. And I also, as part of my job, help edit a vertical at slate.com called Trials and Error. Before I did this job, I came here for law school, and then I left law school and became a journalist. And when I was a journalist, I covered prosecutors. I was the only journalist in the nation covering prosecutors full-time, and I realized very quickly that I had gotten myself into a very tough situation because there are 2,300 prosecutors across the nation, and they're mostly covered by local news, and local news doesn't cover prosecutors very well. And so what I discovered within a few months of starting this job was that I was in over my head because the media had abdicated responsibility when it came to holding the criminal justice system accountable for what it was doing, especially to poor communities and people of color. And it became very clear very quickly why that was. When I was looking for stories to tell nationally about local prosecutors, what I found was that I was sort of scouring local news sources to find any mention of the prosecutor that wasn't related to, necessarily just related to a story about crime. So I was trying to find stories where there was evidence of prosecutorial misconduct. I was trying to find stories where it looked like maybe the prosecutor had overstepped a little. And it's very hard to find those stories when the people covering those stories don't have the resources to know what is actually happening in a courtroom. They don't have the resources to know when a prosecutor seems to be overstepping. They don't have the resources to know when a judge seems to be colluding with the prosecutor. They don't have the resources to be able to tell these stories, and if they can't tell these stories on the local level, nobody can tell them on the national level. And what I discovered very quickly was that the other problem was that they didn't have, they didn't have the relationships. They couldn't risk the relationships. So a lot of journalists on the local level don't just cover criminal justice. They cover crime, and they cover business, and they cover a million other things. They're getting paid very little money to be reporters in small circuits, and they need the prosecutor. They need to call the prosecutor tomorrow to ask them for a statement on a evidence. They want to be able to break stories fast, and they want to be able to have those relationships. And so it made it very difficult for anybody in the local media circuit to be keeping prosecutors, to be holding prosecutors accountable. You guys have heard plenty today about how there's no data about prosecutors pretty much at all, other than what we're seeing from measures for justice. But that's not the only problem. There's just also no general coverage. News outlets are broke. They don't send people like they used to go sit in courtrooms and listen. There's just so little information that you're going to glean from local news, and then as a result from national news on prosecutors. And so there were a couple of things that I was seeing in terms of pattern. One was that there was just a lack of skepticism. Every source that you were reading about in a story was law enforcement. You were never hearing from the defendant, from the defendant's lawyer. You were never hearing from a local organizing group. You were never hearing from families. You were only hearing from law enforcement. There was no questioning language. People use language like violent felon, recidivist, without telling you what that means. What were they accused of before? What were they convicted of before? What are these violent felonies? There was no analysis of what language people were using. And nobody was talking about prosecutors. It was like magic of how misconduct was happening, because you could not find a prosecutor's name in the news. What people were talking about was leniency. You could always find stories of when the bail was set too low. You could always find stories of when someone was not in jail for long enough. And that translated to national coverage. We talk about the criminal justice system more than we used to, but we still do not cover it in an accurate way. We hear a lot of stories about innocence. You hear a lot of stories about private prisons. If you talk to my parents, and I do this job, and if you talk to them about what mass incarceration is about, they would say innocence in private prisons. When we actually know that that's not, if we got rid of all the innocent people and all the private prisons tomorrow, we'd still have a major problem. So what we started to do at the Fair Punishment Project is try to tell a different story, and fundamentally try to prepare and resource local journalists and national journalists to be able to tell different stories. Try to offer them resources to be able to FOIA things for them, to be able to investigate things for them if they needed some help and some backup, to be able to help them ask the right questions at press conferences, help them think twice before they use the dichotomy violent, nonviolent, to actually try to interrogate media coverage of how this system works. Because John made such an interesting point earlier, which is that we say we believe in reform, but when it actually comes down to it, the electorate doesn't. And so much of that has to do with how the media covers the criminal justice system. It's a massive thing. You can look in, my favorite example, I think, is Chicago. I worked with Scott and Katrina a lot on the Anita Alvarez race in Chicago. And Anita Alvarez had been treating people, she had been essentially torturing people for a decade. She had been treating defendants with complete and utter disregard. She had been treating poor people and black and brown people horribly. Chicago was on the front page of every newspaper about how it was so violent and so many people were in jail, but nobody was saying her name. And then she didn't prosecute a police officer. I absolutely think that police officer should have been prosecuted, to be clear. But it was only when Anita Alvarez was lenient for the first time in her entire career that people started to hold her accountable. What we're trying to do at our project is say that leniency is actually not the issue, that innocence is actually not the only problem, and that what we have to do for prosecutors who have very little accountability, not great incentives, and way too much power is shift that equation to make sure that we can hold them accountable for the decisions that they make. So some of the stories that we tell now are about Tony Rackauckus in Orange County and his misuse of jail informants. We were one of the first people to tell the story about, along again with Color of Change, about Seth Williams in Philadelphia and his refusal to, his inability to refuse to charge juveniles who had the opportunity at resentencing. He was still charging a lot of them with life without parole, even though the Supreme Court had said that it should only be happening to juveniles with who were irreparably harmful. We told the story about the new Dallas DA and whether or not she was going to ask for the death penalty, about the Louisiana District Attorneys Association and the influence that they had at the state legislature when they were trying to pass a big bill, a big crime reform bill, just last month, about George Brockler, who's a prosecutor in Colorado, who said that there's no such thing as mass incarceration. People just all started putting other people in jail at the same time, which to me sounds like the point. And these are stories that just wouldn't get told. For a very, very long time, prosecutors have just been able to act with impunity. They've just been able to do what they want without seeing the consequences and run without sort of any concern with their record. And what we're trying to do at our project is make sure that that concern is translating through the way that it's get told in media.
You taking it back?
She can find more scraps of paper.
Oh, yeah. So this is the indicator that we're running out of time, and I'm taking this. So I'll be brief no matter how long this takes. And I'm standing at the podium because I don't know again when I'm ever going to have evidence that I was speaking at Harvard. So please take lots of pictures, post them to my Facebook and social media. No, just kidding. So I want to do two things, and the first thing is not related to the second. I want to do what I was sent here to do. Yeah, so in my introduction, what I want to say is that there's conversations about violence versus nonviolence. And those of us who are advocates realize that that separation is harming our capacity to really build a movement to decarcerate our nation. So I'm offering up my personal testimony that I spent 6.5 years in Pennsylvania state prisons for robbery, kidnapping, criminal conspiracy, and a violation of the Uniform Firearms Act. Today, 17 years after my release from Pennsylvania state prisons, I am the deputy director of the ACLU's Campaign for Smart Justice in our national office. So I just wanted to say that. But what brings me here is to talk about the amazing work that we're beginning to do at the Campaign for Smart Justice. So really recently, the ACLU decided to get involved in prosecutorial reform work. It's headed by a gentleman by the name of Taylor Pendergrass, who's one of the nation's foremost experts on this matter. And he came up with a strategy where the ACLU would spearhead efforts, and it's called our 10-10-10. And it's doing 10 pieces of legislation, doing 10 voter engagement efforts, and I forget the other 10. But there are 30 things that we're going to do all across. Yeah, 10 lawsuits. Yeah, so 10 pieces of legislation. We're suing prosecutors 10 times when it makes sense, and then we're doing 10 GOTV efforts. Very recently, in conjunction with the Color of Change, with PICO, and Power, which is the Philadelphia base, the ACLU was also a part of that coalition, but we also decided to do our own campaign during this election in the city of Philadelphia. So it was a GOTV effort, and we had 3 distinctive goals and objectives. First, we realized that this field of candidates in the city of Philadelphia were already really progressive. So we wanted to move that field as far left as we could. Then we also did an analysis of membership in the Philadelphia area, and we discovered that the ACLU had over 12,000 members who were registered voters in the city of Philadelphia, where typically the turnout for election in Philadelphia is about 110 to 130,000. So we had a little less than 8% of eligible voters in Philadelphia who were ACLU members. So our second goal was to mobilize ACLU members to go out and vote in this district attorney's race. And then the third goal was to mobilize 3,000 formerly incarcerated people to go out and vote for a district attorney that represented what we call smart justice at the ACLU's Campaign for Smart Justice. And I want to talk to you more about a tactic in this overall strategy. Having served time in Pennsylvania state prisons and being an advocate in the city of Philadelphia for about 16 years, there are a substantial number of organizations that are run by formerly incarcerated people. And just as my colleague from PICO indicated, we frequently know that we need to center this work around the people who have been impacted by our justice system or injustice system. There are 100 million Americans living with criminal records. 100 million. 85% or 87% return home after incarceration. So that means we are living among you. I think if we polled the number of people in this audience who have been in conflict with the criminal justice system and including arrest and or convictions, I think we might be really surprised. So, however, in centering that, we decided that we would take people with criminal histories and employ them at a living wage to serve as the canvassers and the campaign managers for this particular campaign. And that's a noble thing to do, right? We want to provide employment opportunities for people who traditionally find it really difficult to find employment. But let's be honest, who knows more about our criminal justice system? Who are the greatest experts than individuals who have actually been convicted and served time in our nation's jails and prisons? But something we didn't anticipate. It was their ability to articulate what transpired as the result of the culture of prosecution in the city of Philadelphia. And to be able to knock on an ACLU member's door and explain to someone the importance of their vote in the personal lives of everyday Philadelphians who were just like them. We ended up hiring altogether 51 formerly incarcerated people who knocked on more than 12,000 doors twice throughout the campaign over an 8-week period. In Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court ruled that people who were children who were sentenced to die in prison, it was unconstitutional, so some of those individuals were home. We ended up hiring 4 formerly incarcerated people who were sentenced to die as juveniles in prison. One gentleman had spent 47 years in prison from the age of 14. He had been home for a week before we employed him. Imagine having that gentleman knock on your door asking you to go and vote for a district attorney, or him trying to indicate to you how important it was for you to know who your district attorney was, the power that they had, and how their decisions impact the lives of everyday, ordinary Americans. So the success of this campaign, which was greatly unanticipated, was that traditionally when you hire people to canvass, you have a significantly high turnover rate of about 50%. So we expected to have to continuously hire people, but that didn't happen. Over the course of the period, we had an attrition rate of about 4%. In addition to that, with the coalition's partners' work and with the atmosphere that had been created in the city of Philadelphia, because of the popularity of this district attorney's race, because the district attorney was currently being indicted and couldn't run or decided not to run. Well, I think a judge decided for him, actually, or a grand jury. There was a 50% increase in voter turnout during this election. So, right, so some amazing things transpired with our very first out of 10 GOTV votercation efforts. And what we're actually going to do is time. So I'm here because the Massachusetts affiliate, the Massachusetts ACLU, is currently considering operating the same strategy and tactic. So I'm so excited. You guys have a great amount of lead-up time. We had about 2 weeks before we engaged in this effort. So you guys are going to do it a lot smarter and a lot better. And so amazed to see so many people that are already here discovering what a difference a DA makes. I'm going to give this back now.
Isn't it always your family that ignores you the most? So I know that I was pretty militant about these wonderful, wonderful speakers' time. So let's once again thank them all for coming here. And the reason I did that was because I wanted to give us time to actually ask questions after this panel. So what we're going to do is, please, people come up for these panelists. What I'm going to do is we're going to do a period of time of questions on their presentations. Then, before we kind of shift gears, as I said before, to talk to and see what other people are thinking about what they're doing in their lives, that Rasan's going to help me facilitate, I'm going to go back and ask each one of these panelists, what would they suggest we do here in Massachusetts? But first, if anybody has questions for any of the speakers up here, please come up to the mic.
Well, I could ask a lot of you questions, but I'm just going to talk to Dan for a minute because I'm from Tewksbury. Yay! So I want to say it's interesting that the Motel Caswell in my town, of course, was known as the most. Everybody went there for prostitution. Everybody went there for drugs. And I just want to talk about, it's so interesting to hear you talk about it from your perspective, and everybody sort of falling in step. And I'm an activist, and yet I have in my mind terrible thoughts about the Motel Caswell. And I think it's really interesting. And as a writer, I understand how we can help shape dialogue and help shape thinking in the press. But if anybody in Tewksbury was to talk to you about that hotel, they would all say it's a shame. Thank God that hotel was torn down. It's a shame that family wasn't put out of business because nobody knows the information that you're putting across here. So I think one of the things I'd like to ask you, and maybe anybody else wants to answer this. So what do you think those of us who are writers, those of us who are advocates and writers and not just journalists, I don't consider myself a journalist, I consider myself a prison advocate and a writer and a professor, how can we help get this kind of information across? Because the public doesn't, the public knows zippo about this and they'd be just like me.
Well, that's a great question, and thank you for asking. Just related to the Motel Caswell itself, we faced a hostile local press because of
The reputation of the motel. But the interesting thing was that same local press went to the trial and covered it, and the coverage got more and more favorable as Russ and his family testified. Because although you're right, there are plenty of crimes committed at the Motel Caswell, A lot of those crimes were the reason that anyone was apprehended is because Russ or someone at his motel noticed that there was something amiss and called the police to come to the hotel and deal with somebody who was up to no good. In terms of how to get the story out about that, we have a media team that's part of our law firm that helps tell the stories, reach out to journalists who are interested in doing a little bit of a deeper dive. And I think that's really important because the coverage of crime stories and issues related to civil forfeiture typically is extremely superficial, and it requires more depth. So supporting local journalism outfits that actually do in-depth reporting, sustained feature writing on what's going on, I think that's really important. In terms of what you can do as a writer or someone to engage with the community, I think certainly whatever you write, trying to connect on social media to not just promote it kind of out into space, but connect to the people who are actually covering these issues in your community. Find the 5 or 7 reporters that might actually be writing interesting stories about that, and tweet what you've written about them. If you're writing a blog or if you're writing a much more long form piece, try to get the folks who are involved in that community engaged in a dialogue on social media or in the real world, and see about getting them interested in an issue if they're not already writing about it. And I think that can play a huge role, because in many of these forfeiture cases and in many criminal justice issues all over the country, things don't change until there's public attention brought, and one of the best ways to bring public attention is the front page of a newspaper.
I can bring this up again later with Rasan.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, Josie, do you want to answer that? Because, where can writers go as a writer?
You can always just call me if you want, and I'll try to help. But no, I thought.
But if we all don't have your number, where else can writers go?
No, I mean, I think that that this is the constant struggle, is trying to make sure that in situations like this, where maybe a place has a bad reputation or a person, there are bad facts, but there is still something, just such a violation of people's rights happening at the same time, to try to do what you can as constituents to encourage local media to be held responsible. They are responsive in the same way that politicians are supposedly responsive, and so trying to express your displeasure or pleasure when the media coverage is favorable or unfavorable is really, really important.
I'm sorry, can I respond to it just for a second?
Go.
I'm glad you asked this question and told the story from a local perspective, because even as I listened to Dan, I was feeling that the missing piece of the story was that this is a place where everyone locally thinks it's full of drugs, prostitution, whatever, right? And we get those narratives around places like, who knows? I don't know if you know that, right? Because there were only 15 arrests. Is that right?
Well, yeah, that was all the government presented at trial.
Right.
Surely there were other arrests and things,
Okay.
but the government didn't present them
But
at trial.
I'm not trying to debate that point. Thank you for clarifying that. But the point is, if I'm a writer and I'm writing about a situation like this, a couple questions I would ask is why, and what outcomes do we want out of the situation? So, why is this a place that has drugs, prostitution, and what would we want? I think whether it's civil forfeiture or DAs that are hardcore in sentencing, bail amounts, whatever. It's like we always fall back to these punitive measures. How harsh can we be on someone? How do we, put stamp the fire out as hard as possible, hit every nail, hit everything with a hammer, it was a nail or not, right? I would ask a bunch of questions like, okay, say this is a place of addiction and prostitution. What do those folks need to get on the right track? Because you can shut this hotel down, and my guess is those businesses are going to continue to operate as long as the underlying conditions that drive people into those economies exist. So my question would, what if instead of sending the cops to the hotel, we sent, addiction therapists or folks who can provide services to women in need. Not saying that's an end-all be-all solution, but we don't always have to go to this question of, well, was it a bad place, then therefore we do the worst thing to the people there or the institution.
We could also not criminalize human behavior, right?
Good afternoon. I'm coming as a retiree from a local organization, a sheltering program, Pine Street Inn, after close to 22 years, and having a heart for the population. And I wanted to address an issue of the overcrowding of prisons, and now the early release of a lot of individuals, and those individuals being early released to a tune of that they have to wear bracelets, and they have to pay for, it's my understanding, the monitoring of their bracelet, and then they also have to buy the bracelet that the court system or whoever gets to keep. And yes. Then, beside all of that, this payment that they have to make, a lot of individuals cannot get employment because of their former residence. And so now they're in the predicament of being faced with going back because they're not keeping their agreement. Anybody want to address parts of that?
Yeah, I think I'll take that one. Thank you for that question, sir, or that comment too. So I just want to say flat out that, well, first I should say that the ACLU National Office and Just Leadership USA have just come into agreement where we're going to do a report on mass surveillance. Because quite frequently we're talking about alternatives to incarceration, we're talking about pretrial release, and what I know is that we don't want to be locked up in our own neighborhoods, and that all of us should be concerned with the implementation of increasing the surveillance of American citizens. And quite naturally, right, with collateral consequences of 44,000, obviously impairing a person's ability to get employment and then requiring them to actually pay for this is not a solution that we want implemented across the country. So thank you for raising that ridiculous barrier that we're putting in front of people, with their liberties and freedom.
All day, voter participation has been encouraged. It would be helpful for me if I could have a list of questions or pieces of information that we should know about the DAs that are being elected, particularly information that we could use in letter to the editors if they're running unopposed.
I'm going to grab this. Thank you. That is, and I didn't even plant that. So you've been hearing us alluding to the ACLU of Massachusetts. We are working on a campaign that we're going to be rolling out next fall called What a Difference a DA Makes. And what we are going to be looking at that is exactly this type of thing. What are the types of questions we should be asking DAs? What do we, first of all, letting people know about the current sitting DAs. And this is purely a voter education project. I want to underscore that the ACLU is a nonpartisan, non-electioneering organization. So what we are going to be putting together is exactly what you're talking about. We need to help voters make informed decisions, and it's not voters' faults if they don't, because they've never been given this information. So we need to step into that void. And what we hope at the ACLU is that, because I'm just now talking about this in the foreshadowing way, that this is a campaign of all of us and everybody else we know and everybody else they know. Because what we need to do, you heard the numbers that we were talking about in Massachusetts, and I'm going to say them again. 20 years, 77% of races uncontested. You know what happens when a race is uncontested? The candidate raises a little bit of money, goes out with his buddies, puts the money in the bank, and goes home. Because there's no debate, there's no questioning, there's nothing going on. There is no campaign to run. So it is a wonderful question, and so that is part of the work you've seen that you've been hearing from folks all over the day how advocates across the country are trying to figure out these metrics and the way to talk about district attorneys, and that we here in Massachusetts are hopefully with partners. As I said, hopefully everybody in this room, you can sign up to get information about the campaign outside, and moving forward in educating our voters so they can start asking the right questions directly to the candidates.
Just in the really excited to hear about that. Hopefully we can collaborate here in Massachusetts. In terms of like what kinds of questions and maybe what to put in an LTE. First of all, I would highly suggest reading, what's the name of the thing again, Josie?
Which are you talking about?
It's your Slate vertical.
Oh, Trials and Error.
Trials and Error.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you
Yes.
for doing my self-promo.
Just,
$10 like,
well, I just think it's a steady stream of really strong messaging around prosecutors. In terms of questions, there's a few groups around the country that have done, I think at the local level, candidate questionnaires, and in that, including the work that we did together in Philly. All three other organizations here collaborated on. If you go to the website, it's phillydaforthepeople.org. Sorry, that's long. Say it again. phillydaforthepeople.org. There are questionnaires there with the candidates' answers actually as well, so you can check out like the types of responses you also might see. And I don't know, has Pico done questionnaire stuff like that? Yeah.
Philly that was. Yeah, so we did one in Philadelphia that's online, and I was going to show you, but I ran out of time. But I think the questions you want to be looking at and some of the measures you want to be thinking about is how many folks are locked up right now in county jails that are there because they can't afford bail, right? If you can get any numbers on disparities and how African American or Latino communities are being impacted differently than white communities around this. One of the things that we found incredibly helpful as we were doing the scorecards was going and talking to public defenders. So if you talk to the DA, it's likely they either they aren't capturing the information or they're not going to share it with you. Both, right? So if you go to the public defender, though, and you ask them for trends, or you ask them for what they're up against, oftentimes we were getting different types of information. And then I think the other thing to be thinking about as you're thinking about your voter work is that, number one, many of us outside of the Philadelphia race have had to consistently respond to who's throwing their hat in the race without us having any conversation about who would be the best person. So there's a conversation about what it means for us, and this is the C4 side, so I'm wearing my PICO Action Fund hat, but there is a conversation about how we are making sure that folks that understand our communities are actually running. And then the second thing, I ran past it really quickly in the PowerPoint, but in Hillsborough County, Florida, we talked to a huge number of folks, knocked on doors. We got 4,700 black and brown voters in Hillsborough to commit to voting down ballot in the DA race, right? Andrew Warren won that seat by 5,070 votes. Okay? We ran a bigger field campaign than he did. He would show up with pizzas to feed our volunteers, and we basically had to say to him, we're not doing it for you, we're doing it for us. And we'll be back in your face the day after, November 8th, whatever the day was, right? So there's a couple things to be thinking about, and to be, the thing I love about Measures for Justice, and I don't think Massachusetts is on the list, but there's some, but you can begin to look at where, it's not a surprise about where folks are being locked up in and what communities, and so I would also suggest you start figuring out where that is and asking those people what they want you to ask the prosecutors, and bringing them into the room, because if you do it by yourself, you will be by yourself going all the way up to the election and afterwards.
Yep. Hi. So my name is Charlene DeCalagero, and it's very interesting hearing about the lack of contested races among DA races. And I hate to say it, but I'm not exactly shocked because I was not born in this state, and I had high hopes moving here, only to discover that Massachusetts has some of the consistently least number of contested races at any level in the country. So I don't know why it would be different for DAs than anybody else. In fact, more more likely. So my questions are, and I say this, having been in 2016 one of the 1/3 of state rep races in this state that was contested. So if it hadn't been for me, it'd have been less. So I want to ask the question, 2 questions. How do we support taking profit out of the legal system? And I mean that for both the system that incarcerates people and the system that is the so-called civil system that just takes your property, which the same groups of people are being disproportionately deprived of their homes through illegal foreclosures, which is something I've been active on. So there's a real connection there. And how do we get a fair tax system that treats us all as human beings entitled to due process?
I will give any of the panelists a pass on the tax question, just in case that might not be areas of expertise, but.
I'll reluctantly go and try to answer the first. So I think how do you take profit out of any system in America? You don't. It is a capitalist system. And no matter what happens, what we can hope to do, and there have been national efforts to do with it through the Justice Reinvestment Act, is you want to take the money out of that system and then invest it in things that are going to not contribute to the outcomes that you don't want. Outside of that, I have no answer.
I can speak to it with respect to the forfeiture question on the civil side. The best way to reduce those incentives is to put a firewall between the money and law enforcement. And the way to do that is to pass reforms, as a number of states have done, and is in the current bill, House Bill 2316, that sends any money or other property that is seized through and taken through civil forfeiture not back to the DA's office or the law enforcement agencies, but to the general fund. If the money goes to the general fund, then that's up to the legislature to exercise its spending power, and there's no special incentive for prosecutors and DA and law enforcement agencies to go after that money. We've seen dramatic changes in behavior when that sort of thing happens. There are pretty infamous places, like outside of Nashville, where the police will camp out on one side of the freeway where they think the money is coming and not the side of the freeway where they think the drugs are going. This is east-west freeway. 90% of the time, they camp out on the side that is headed back west from the East Coast, because that's the side where they think the money is going to be, and 90% of the time they're pulling people over there, and they're not pulling people over on the drug side, because they don't care about the drug side. If they get drugs, they have to destroy them. If they get money, that's goodies. That's, trips to Aspen, that's sports cars for highway interdiction efforts, that's a margarita machine, not a joke, an actual thing this money has been spent on. If you take that money and instead send it to the Tennessee state legislature, they're probably not going to be buying margarita machines for cops.
I mean, and also only 3 states have outlawed civil asset forfeiture altogether, so the other 47 could follow suit as well.
Yes, there are a number of other reforms that would raise the burdens, would dramatically change how civil forfeiture works, eliminate it if possible, but at least restrict it. But the number one thing to do is to send the money back to the general fund and not to the cops and prosecutors.
Yeah, just real quickly on just getting profits out, because it has been a big focus for Color of Change. I agree with Bill that this is a capitalist system and there will always be efforts to profit, but at the same time, we have not always had private prisons, or we haven't always had a bail industry, and it has blown up really over the last few decades. So, some of these phenomenon of profiteering in the criminal justice system are relatively new. And I think that means we may be able to reverse the trend, but our kind of strategy has typically been to, one, expose these industries, make people aware of who they are, and expose people doing business with them. So if you are, for instance, give you an example. I don't know if anybody has like an Aladdin water bottle in here. They sell them at Target. But anyway, they're owned by the same company that owns a big bail bonds company. So there's leverage against public brands like that. And then the other thing for us is driving a wedge between, and exposing is a part of this, but driving a wedge between public officials and these businesses. So maybe the biggest success that we had on this was actually during the 2000, well, it's a qualified success now, during the last presidential election, where we got, we negotiated with Hillary Clinton. It was early news. The Intercept exposed that she was taking money from private prison lobbyists, basically, into her campaign. And, we negotiated with her, basically saying, stop, don't do this, stop, or we're going to make a big deal out of it, to key people that she was counting on to win the primary, Black women voters, which is the majority of our list. She ended up coming out announcing not only that she was cutting ties with private prison lobbyists, but also saying that she didn't think any politician should be taking the money. And we actually saw, when looking back at the money from this cycle versus the previous one, that the number of Democrats that took private prison money basically almost bottomed out, to the point where we could probably, in a day, write a letter to the ones that were still at the congressional level, and target those folks. So I do think there's some opportunities as we help create a negative image of some of these businesses and profit motives, and then try to figure out where to intervene with politicians and their relationships. At least it gives these corporations less leverage in the system, I think.
2 quick points just to piggyback on Scott's points. Color of Change and ACLU just recently put out a report on the bail industry. You should look for that on either of our websites. And then just in case people don't know, there are only 2 nations in the world that have cash bail systems, and that's the United States and the Philippines. And we all know about the Philippines criminal justice system, right?
I would just add real quickly, part of what happened and why we were able to get rid of Corizon in Alameda County was because Mario Martinez's mom called a bunch of news outlets and told them about it. And then I went online and looked up the 990s, right, which is corporations have to file when they give money to elected officials. So I pulled up a bunch of 990s and got lists of every elected official who got money from Corizon, and we fed that to the news, to the reporter, and they did an expose, and they did a 3-part expose, and one of the names of the second story was blood money. And so I think it does. If we can make the money that folks get really dirty, it pushes people to go in a different direction.
Hi, I'm Dan Meehan. I work with reentry and rates of recidivism at New Start Project. I'm an honorable discharge veteran, student at Suffolk University in applied legal, and I'm a felon. I did 8 years, pretty much in every county up and down the East Coast. Up and down Eastern Massachusetts. What my question is, well, of course, I'm sure the ADAs want to know which district attorneys are you going to go after, and inquiring minds want to know. And the other question I was going to ask is, have they tried? From my experience going in and out of the system, I was sick and I needed treatment. And I got treatment from Essex County through a grant of a federal program. I then subsequently realized I had PTSD and all that. I've not been back to jail since for 9 years. Now, have they decided or thought about going after sheriffs that refuse in the state of Massachusetts to implement programs to keep the recidivism rate down? Yep. And that's the questions. Thank you.
So as far as we are not going after DAs, that's not what we're talking about in voter education. And if that's being assumed going after DAs, then okay, you can call it that, but what we're actually doing is saying that these are very powerful people who have so much control over real people's lives. And the only place that they are held accountable is the ballot box. And we're not getting out there voting. We're not understanding the issues as voters, as people here in the Commonwealth. So we are doing a voter education campaign to make sure that in all 11 districts, so even though we have 14 counties in Massachusetts, we have 11 district attorneys, that voters in all of those districts are going to be educated and go out and vote and get down the ballot. You know, it's like first learn about it, then actually get out and vote, and then please go all the way down the ballot to vote for DA and making sure that's important. Now, one of the things that I think is very important when educating voters and the general public, you know, so I'm talking as the ACLU, a nonpartisan, non-electioneering organization. There are many organizations out there who may decide to look at actual candidates' races and look and do that type of work here in Massachusetts. But one of the most important things, the reason that, you know, we're here in 2017 with elections coming up in 2018 is because it's a lot easier to organize and get people out to vote for an elected official once the voters actually know what that elected official does.
So thank you for sharing that. Just publicly, I want to say something that I frequently say to us. Language is important, right? And I think you've heard me talk about my criminal justice interaction, and I don't think anybody ever heard me indicate that I was a felon, an ex-con, a convict, a robber, a kidnapping. I'm a person. You're a person. We just so happen to have been in conflict with the criminal justice system. I say that there's a king and there's a fool in every person, and whomever you speak to will answer. So thank you, and good luck.
Thank you.
My name is Lois Arendt, and I'm from Western Mass, where our DA just successfully prosecuted someone for manslaughter for selling heroin to a person who overdosed. And so just want to say that that's out there. It happened in Hampshire County with our DA, Sullivan, and it's in the paper. I suggest you look for it because it's a precedent. It's a really, really bad precedent for out in Western Mass. It's a bad precedent for the rest of Massachusetts and for the country. So it's happening, and people need to pay attention to it. And this is about, I mean, there actually was one story in the paper that was a story discussing what was going on and different people's views about this prosecution. So that did happen in the Hampshire Gazette. That's not what I wanted to talk about, though. Last year during the sheriff's race, a number of people here took part in a project that I initiated, which was a series, a questionnaire that we came up with and sent to every candidate. There were a lot of races where there was no contested race. And I mean, you can go down the ballot, but I'm not going to go down the ballot and vote for Dave Sullivan. You know, he's the only guy on the ballot. So I can go as far as I want. I'm not going to vote for I'm not going to vote for an uncontested sheriff. So yeah, I mean, we want to get out the vote, but we need to get out the vote if there are other candidates. We need people to go down the ballot if there are other candidates. And so part of the challenge is getting people to run for these offices, whether it's sheriff, which is just as uncontested as DAs in Massachusetts. I mean, these guys are in there till they die, you know, or till they get a better offer or something. And so, I mean, that's why they're there, you know, they just stay there. So we had we put this up on the Criminal Justice Policy Coalition website. We had a fact sheet about jails in every county, how much they were spending, who was locked up, how many people were there pre-trial. We had the questionnaires. We had the answers to the questionnaires. We encouraged, like the League of Women Voters, when they had a forum, to invite the sheriff, whether the sheriff had an opponent or not. And a lot of them use those questionnaires or use pieces of those questionnaires. We sent those questionnaire answers to the press in our local communities because at least it got these people to go on record. And they were never asked the questions, so they never were held accountable in any way because they never had to go on record. So, I mean, in terms of moving forward for DA races in 2018, you can look, there's still the thing up there. It says Sheriff's Races 2016 at Criminal Justice Policy Coalition website. You can look at it. Thank you. I always get the letters screwed up, so I don't say the letters. And so I encourage you to look at that as a model as we go forward, because I think it is a good model, and I think it did engage people. It really told people what is it that sheriffs do, which people were basically clueless about, in the same way that they're clueless about even more power, much, much more power of DAs. So, 2018.
Thank you, Lois. And that was actually a great sequitur into, Rasan, do you have a question or are you facilitating?
Can I just say something about the opioid thing? We're coming out with a big project in 2 months, a weeks-long news project about opioid prosecutions as murder. That you see that a lot now, that they prosecute dealers with murder charges when they, or even a boyfriend will share heroin with their girlfriend and the girlfriend will overdose and the boyfriend will be charged with murder. It happens all the time now. And so we are coming out with a big project in collaboration with the Drug Policy Alliance on that.
Thank you, Josie. Anybody else? So the sequitur is we're now going to get to the point, but we're going to start with the panel again. But I want to just pull back again. We are in this room, and we are a part of all of this, and we all bring different things to the table. You have seen we have amazing criminal justice statisticians. We have amazing people who work in communities. We have amazing people who are trying to mobilize and give a voice to formerly incarcerated people. We have amazing people that are out there that understand the system. We need to do this together. And we need to all bring what we can and cannot do to the table. What was the great things that I loved in hearing, especially part of the morning panel and all the wonderful organizations that are up there, folks kept talking about Taylor Pendergrast, who is nationally CLU. Well, Taylor's a big part of what we're developing here in Massachusetts. So we're right here at the beginning, and we want all of you to be involved with this with us in whatever capacity you can do. But I want to go down before we do open it up to folks talking about what they're doing in the community, just like Lois did. Wanted to go through 2-3 minutes, whatever you all want. We're actually doing great. What would you suggest? So we're here in Massachusetts. We know we're getting ready for a 2018 election of all of our 11 DAs. What do the folks think that we should be looking on, and how should we be talking to voters about stuff?
I'll start, but I'm going to go even to more basic. I think that what could be done specifically with the amount of lead-up time that you have is for there to be a loose agreement to come together at a certain frequency just about this matter. As we were building our coalition, we discovered that we left lots of things on the table because we didn't have a lot of lead-up time. But the more frequently that you meet in the beginning, is the better the outcomes will be for the entire collective's effort.
I was also going to say that building coalitions and making sure you're working with groups within the community is really important. Hosting town halls has proved to be very effective, and when people show up, last time the Dallas DA had a race, which was 2012, I think 9 people showed up to the Dallas DA's town hall, and Dallas is not a small town. So, making sure that you actually show up and ask the questions is really, really, really important. And obviously, I'm going to beat this drum all the way, but media coverage is a huge thing, and DAs are very, very, very affected and receptive to media coverage because they get so little of it. You can write another bad article about Donald Trump and he's not going to notice, but if you write a bad article about your DA, it catches on. The return on that investment is actually really massive, and so making sure that the stories are being told well locally and then really told nationally, because there are a lot of stories out there, is critical. So again, you can always get in touch with us and we'll help you.
I'll just comment on what can be done in the realm of forfeiture reform. Massachusetts is a state that has a lot of improvement to make in that area, and so I would start modestly, because even modest improvements are going to be pretty hard fought. Typically, the sheriff's associations and the district attorneys associations will pressure politicians very hard on these legislative reforms. So it's often a multi-year effort. In most states that we've been involved in, it has taken 2 or 3 or more legislative sessions to get some of the reform bills through. I would start with getting more reporting on what is done with these forfeiture funds, getting information on who this is taken from, what the disposition of the case is, was the person ever actually convicted, what were the charges. We have a model bill on our website that is just a reporting bill, and it is hard for prosecutors and sheriff's associations to fight because it's just about more information. It's just about providing transparency, and they'll sort of whine about, oh well, it creates more of a paperwork burden for us, but they don't have much else to say about it other than that. And if their position is there really is no problem, then the data will show that. So let's just get the data and make it available to the public. So a reporting provision is the first thing. Massachusetts, you only need probable cause to forfeit someone's property. That's insane. That standard needs to be changed. It needs to be, in most states, it's preponderance of the evidence, which is still too low. The current bill, 2316, would raise it to clear and convincing evidence. Anything's better than probable cause, though. It's the lowest standard that's out there. And of course, redirecting the funds away from prosecutors' offices and law enforcement agencies to the general fund. And House Bill 2316 does all of those things. For that reason, it is being vigorously fought by law enforcement agencies in the state, and it may be several years before a comprehensive reform bill like that is actually able to pass. That doesn't mean you should give up. Keep fighting and try to get a reporting requirement through early so that somebody can use the data from that to show what the problem is with forfeiture across the state. And take hope. Since 2014, 22 states have already reformed their forfeiture laws. 2 of them have actually eliminated civil forfeiture altogether. Others have only passed reporting bills, and there's been a wide variety of things in between. There is a strong movement to reform civil forfeiture and hopefully eventually also criminal forfeiture in this country. And Massachusetts is definitely one of the states that I think is likely to pass reform sometime in the next several years.
So Pico, California is actually partnering with the ACLU of Northern California to do some prep work before basically the entire state of California is up for re-election around the DAs. Only 2 aren't. So we have a big slate. And so what we're partnering with the ACLU Northern California to do is a few things. Number one, to educate voters before the actual election. So that is totally nonpartisan. If you talk about and share what the current DA, the incumbent DA, is doing and not doing, it can really shape the race before it even happens. So doing research, understanding what the DA is doing, not doing, get them to go on record publicly around these different issues. So do they support bail reform? What's their stuff around, all these different pieces? Where do they stand? And really educating folks early. I also think that we cannot and should not be as bad as political campaigns when we go to talk to voters. So only stopping in a community of color and knocking on doors or calling 2 or 3 days or 2 or 3 weeks before the election and using people to change who's in office makes us just as bad as some of the worst transactional organizations in the country. So I also think beginning to reach out to folks now and having those conversations on the doors really does make an incredible impact and difference in who's going to help guide the work that you'd be doing around the races. And the last thing that I would just say, and we got some help from the Fair Punishment Project around this a while ago, is we got them to do, and I don't mean to add more work, but we got them to do one-page profiles for us on the DAs that we're looking at in 2017. We were looking at 2017 and 2018. So we have these great one-page profiles that just talk about who they are and what horrible stuff they've done. Or great stuff, I guess, in some cases. But I think those are some pieces that I would be thinking about doing and that we're going to do with the ACLU of Northern California. So, what is that? Huh?
I thought you only did one pagers for us, Josie. Like Pico too? No, I joke.
Have you done any one pages for the ACLU?
Y'all got your own lawyers. Chill out. All right. Also, I'm shaking my head because Andrea just said everything I was planning to say about yes, thanks. Organizers thinking alike, as she was saying. Don't wait for the election. We've had the most success in targeting DAs when we've had a steady drumbeat on them a year out or more. Pay close attention to what they're doing. Take kind of moments. In my work, we would call these rapid response moments. Something has happened that's in the news. It may or may not in the news be connected to the DA. Figure out how to connect it, right? And put their name in everybody's mouth, basically. The other is focus on a systemic change that you want to see, right? Something that you would want the next DA to implement, and start with the person now, even if they're not on board. You can bring public attention to their resistance, right? But also start to create the at least appearance of an environment where there are people who are fighting for progressive solutions out of DA offices. And this is to the point of this lack of candidates, right? I think we've kind of accepted that we're not going to be able to recruit a bunch of awesome DA candidates off of, today, right? Hopefully there's some Harvard Law School students in here that are thinking about it. But generally people who are aligned with us, that come out of law school, the last thing they think about is being a prosecutor. The only way we're going to get that to happen is if there's a clear groundswell where people understand that A, they can win, and they'd have the community support to implement the kind of reforms that we would want to see. So we have to just create that energy out there. And then, so I would just think about organizing. One thing the Color of Changes is going to be doing over the next couple of months is we're launching a campaign with our members to build small teams of doing prosecutor accountability work. They'll take demands around things like bail reform to their prosecutors. I would encourage everybody in here. You can go on colorofchange.org and sign up, of course, but you could just start with your own network. If you have several people who are that interested, call up your DA's office, see if you can meet with someone, talk about your concerns and issues, put the pressure on them. That many people are doing that, so it could work. And I think you can also dig in. If you feel like you don't know enough, a suggestion that I would make early on is thinking about even a court watch program. How do you figure out what your DA is doing and their staff are doing day in and day out in the courts? Well, one way is to send folks to watch and document what's happening, and build up the evidence for whether it be an inside strategy where you're going to try and negotiate with them around something that you're seeing, or if you want to do what folks have been saying here, which is expose, right? That's some of the work that we can be doing for journalists, right? Collecting that data for them. So yeah, I would say think about it right now, because you can create the environment in 2000. I think you have plenty of time right now to create that environment for 2018 to potentially get the right people to run, get the folks who are running moving to your side, and get media talking about the narrative that you want to be at the center of the race. So I wish everyone luck who would want to do that, and definitely Color Change is here to support folks, so let us know if we can help.